The first type of real estate investment that we're going to cover is investment in single family housing. We're going to analyze home ownership versus renting and then talk about the characteristics that impact the supply and the demand for housing. And then we'll talk a little bit about pricing, federal income tax treatment for homeowners, and then we'll wrap up with investing in distressed houses. So let's start with house prices and demand. Growth in population and households is a necessary condition for housing demand. And so we see a very strong association between house price appreciation and income or employment growth. So as people are making more money, that increases their demand for housing, which increases the price of housing. So increases in interest rates, though, tend to have a negative influence on home ownership because higher interest rates make home ownership more expensive. So if renting is more cost effective than owning, then home ownership may not always be a better investment. So that's why we want to do this analysis of renting versus owning. So let's assume that a property could be rented for $12,000 per year or $1,000 a month, or it could be purchased for $150,000 with $30,000 down and financed with a fully amortizing mortgage loan of $120,000. That's the 150 minus the $30,000 down payment at an interest rate of 4.5% over 30 years. So in our analysis, we're doing a cash flow analysis. And so you'll see over 5 years, we've got first our before tax cash flows. And this is for the owner. So the owner is going to have property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and then mortgage payments. And here we're just going to include principal and interest. So that gives us a total cash outflow before taxes. But because we're owning in this scenario, there are tax deductions that are available to the homeowner. So we've got property taxes and interest, which gives us total deductions. And then depending upon the tax bracket of the homeowner, and we're using 28% here, then we have a tax savings that's attributable to home ownership. Now, let's switch over to the renter. Remember, our renter is paying $12,000 a year or $1,000 a month in rent. Our net cash flows then of owning will take our before tax cash outlays, that was the property taxes and the insurance and the maintenance and the mortgage payments, and then subtract off the tax savings, which came from the property taxes and the interest at our 28% tax rate. So if we subtract the savings from those outlays, we get our after-tax cash flows as an owner. And now we're going to compare that to the rent. And so in this scenario, we're looking at it from the owner's perspective, and we're saying that the owner, because they chose to own instead of rent, they're saving those rent payments. So the rent payments saved are the $12,000. And so now we get our after-tax cash flows to owning. And then in this example, we're going to assume that after 5 years we'll sell. So the property value, less the selling expenses, less the mortgage payoff will be our before tax cash flow from the sale. So actually we're calculating what that would be if we sold in any of these first 5 years. And so our after-tax cash flows is after we pay taxes on the gain from that sale, if there is a gain. And so if we sold in any of the first 3 years, we see that there wouldn't be a gain. And so there wouldn't be any tax. But even in the later years, that because of the tax law, that gain would be excluded and not taxable. So there would be no tax in any of these first 5 years. So now we get our after-tax cash flow, which is the same because there's no tax from the sale. So it's the same as our before tax cash flow, and now we can calculate the IRR. And so you see the rate of return on the investment in owning this home, given the assumptions that we gave from the beginning, the IRR will increase the longer we hold on to the home. So in order to justify renting in this particular case, an investor would have to earn somewhere between 9.8% and 18.6% on an after-tax basis on other investments that are equal in risk with that $30,000 in equity that they would save if they rented. And remember, the $30,000 is that down payment. So what do you do with the proceeds from the sale if you do sell it after year 5? So that's a question that you have to answer. Will the investor choose to own or rent after year 5? And what if the owner chooses not to sell after year 5? Then what happens? So some other questions to answer in this renting versus owning scenario. So let's consider just a couple of other questions before we move on from this renting versus owning analysis. At what level of rent would one be indifferent between renting and owning? Well, the short answer is it's the level of rent that results in an after-tax IRR or internal rate of return from owning that is just sufficient enough to compensate for the capital invested as a down payment. So you can think back to that $30,000 in that last example. So I'd be indifferent if renting just covers that $30,000 investment. Let's do an example to make this make more sense. So let's assume that the after-tax IRR from owning that is just sufficient to compensate for the capital invested as a down payment is 3.5%. So then we would recalculate the net cash flows by changing the rent saved to $6,919 for the first 5 years. So the answer to the question here is if the rent was $69.19, then we would be indifferent given this analysis.